Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Georgetown University Wargaming Society's online lecture series. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Maurice Suckling. Maurice has spent over 25 years writing for video games, including Borderlands, Killing Floor 2, Civilization 6. He now designs commercial historical board war games, including award-winning games like Chancellorsville 1863, Guilds a PhD in creative writing, and an MA in global history. He is an assistant professor in the Games and Simulations Arts and Sciences program at RPI in Upstate New York, where he teaches and researches on game writing and historical simulation. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our speaker to start his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. I want to thank GUWS for inviting me back. This is the second time they've had me back to do a talk. First time I talked about storytelling and war games. So obviously a different topic today, but thank you again. It's a great honor to be invited again. And I think GUWS are doing some fantastic work meshing the hobby and the professional wargaming space together. So thank you. And if you haven't mentally or literally fist bumped Sebastian Bay recently, you should get on that, I think. All right, let's just say a little bit about who I am. Nicholas already gave me a brief introduction. So yes, you know all of this stuff. I think it's worth saying that my research focus, there are two areas that I focus on. One is history in historical board gaming, so not the history of so much, but the sort of the way that we think about history in those kinds of games, and storytelling in games. And obviously there's a connection between those two. Yeah, talked a bit about this, talked about designing board games and various video games. To be clear, I didn't work on Borderlands. I worked on Borderlands, the pre-sequel and the DLC, the Fantastic Voyage game. After that, and one of my recent preoccupations has been post-colonial studies. Perhaps no surprise to those of you who are at this talk. I contributed a chapter to this Routledge book that's out very shortly, and I was looking at design elements in post-colonial commercial historical board war games. I'm not really going to talk about those design elements very much today, but I suppose they have some bearing on some of what I'm going to talk about. So let's talk about post-colonialism and board games. Here's one way of thinking about it. There is no such thing as post-colonialism. The effects of the colonial era are still with us. Scholars will tell you that colonialism itself is still evident and perhaps even inescapable. Humans colonize. Even putting aside political colonialism, economic colonialism is not only rife, it's hardwired into how our world operates, you could say. So post-colonialism doesn't exist. So thank you, obviously, for the invitation. But wait, some of you are thinking that can't be everything he has to say, and you're right. What about the hyphen? So post-colonial with a hyphen, generally used to signify a period that comes chronologically after colonialism, and post-colonial without the hyphen tends to signify the persisting impact of colonization across time periods and geographical regions. So I hope that tidies that up for you. It's obviously not the end. I have a bit more to say. Let's have another go. Let's start by thinking about war games and post-colonialism. Here's another way of thinking about it. War is colonialist, history is colonialist, therefore there is no such thing as a post-colonial war game. In Playing Oppression, Mary Flanagan and Mikhail Jacobson defined colonialism as one nation taking territory and dominating people in this conquered territory, which can lead us to the conclusion war is colonialist, history is colonialist, and therefore there is no such thing as a post-colonial war game. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Well, let's try another way. Let's try talking about colonialism and board games first. Here's what Efka Bladukas from No Pun Included has to say by way of introduction to the topic, although this is just a snippet and he has more to say. Let's see if this will play. Let me just boost.
Apologies, Maurice. I don't think we can hear it.
You can't hear it? Okay, not to worry. I don't know why that is, but he simply was just talking about how if you look on BGG, you look on Board Game Geek, and you look for. By the way, Nicholas, thank you for letting me know. But if you look on Board Game Geek and you do a search for colonialism, you won't see that many entries. But if you extend your search and you start realizing that although colonialism isn't listed as a theme in many instances, it is inherent in the topic, you start to understand the scale of the problem. You start to understand that we have a great many games where colonialism is a featured element. I'm talking about board games in general, but there's a bearing on historical board war games too. The point being that there's a problem, right? There's a lot of colonialism around. If we put the issue of the scope of that problem to one side and focus on the nature of that problem, we could summarize it as we see persistent themes of exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination, 4X as it's often known. We see historical actors persistently presented with a lack of agency, so they're not actors at all, really, just victims. And even if they have agency, it's frequently not meaningful. And this in turn means we have what amounts to an eradication of peoples, eradication of histories of all kinds, histories of slavery, for example. So what, you might say, and indeed people have said this to me. History is exploration, expansion, exploitation, and extermination. All right, some people win, some people lose, survival of the fittest. That's just history, it's competition, right? Well, yes, if that's the only perspective you can conceive of, then that is the only perspective that you can have. But let's just pause for a moment and think about why this even matters. What's the problem with this mindset? Well, for one thing, we've already played out the scenario. See the history of planet Earth from about the late 19th century onwards. It's a dumpster fire. This kind of social Darwinist survival of the fittest thinking about history and human interaction leads to some deeply troubling conclusions. Racial segregation, ethnic cleansing, genocide. Again, I refer you to the planet Earth. It's also just bad history. This is a perspective that chokes the history we can tell into a narrow, homogeneous channel, one that precludes the possibility of more varied interpretations, not unlike a colonialist perspective in and of itself, you might say. With this perspective, we eradicate the potential to see the riches in other cultural traditions, ones that focus on alternative paradigms, for example, harmony with our environment rather than domination of it. This diminishes the whole project of history. We lose alternative and varied narratives we might not understand the relevance of yet, but we deny their utility for the future. We deny and eradicate these narratives, we eradicate humanity. This is worse than bad history. This is bad living. I refer you again to the last slide and the history of planet Earth. This perspective that all life is colonialist is also just wrong. Our board games that only conceive of colonialist perspectives deny the complexity of life as we can evidently experience it and as we can discern from history. I refer you to the excellent talk my friend and designer Jason Matthews gave here last year. Politics is inescapably entwined with military history, especially from the operational and strategic perspectives, and yet it is poorly represented for the most part in the wargaming hobby until, as Jason rightfully says, relatively recently. Even if we want to believe there are only colonialist perspectives in play in wargame situations, there are certainly those who don't. Most of military history is actually asymmetric, it's imbalanced, and a great deal of it is concerned with counterinsurgency. And if you think that just means one side has worse weapons, you have profoundly misunderstood. Military situations are a complex network of advantages and disadvantages to all sides. And more frequently than not, there are more than two sides. A colonialist force may have superior weaponry, but it is likely it has logistical and local intelligence problems, and all sides have to consider the ends, ways, and means by which they can successfully conduct a war. Victory means very different things to different participants. We might summarize this as everything is political. Let's not talk politics is a political statement. And politics is complex and multifaceted because it is derived through humans living together, which, if you've not noticed, is an extremely complex system. If you have one simple take on political perspectives, you are wrong and just haven't lived long or well enough to know it yet. If that wasn't enough incentive to take this perspective on board, there is, of course, the advice from Sun Tzu, know thy enemy. All right, but I'm talking about mainstream board games having a colonialism problem. And there's a difference between games we can describe as history-ish, where mechanics are the focus, and games where there's a genuine attempt to engage seriously with history, right? Well, yes, I think so, although there's a blurry line there. A lazy way to describe the difference can be between Euro games and war games. But I think this framing is about as equally problematic as it is helpful. If we focus on board games that seem to be generally considered war games, as opposed to mainstream hobby board games, we can discern two different kinds of colonialist approaches. There is what we can describe as strategic level colonialism in games like Risk, Pax Britannica, Struggle of Empires, and Imperial Struggle. In these games, indigenous peoples have no agency, are non-playable military and logistical impediments to conquest built into the game system. And they have little to no identity. There's also what we could describe as tactical level colonialism in games like Khyber Rifles and Victoria Cross, both editions. In such games, without strategic level agency, conquest and submission appear ultimately inevitable, and perhaps essentially military contests with plurality and complexity boiled away into more brutalist and colonialist terms. Even with tactical level agency, indigenous histories are confined and contextualized as military triumph or disaster, but within a framework of a persistent colonial narrative. It's essentially a story that's being told for a colonialist audience in a colonialist theater. Let's be clear, just in case there's misunderstanding about this, there should be colonialist board war games. There is a great deal of colonialism in history and in the present. And if our games wish to represent or simulate that history or future outcomes, then we must have games and systems within those games that allow us to do that. In the context of historical board games with intention and capacity to engage with history seriously, the point is not that we shouldn't have these games, but it is that there are other types of games to have too. So all that said, let's talk about post-colonialism in commercial historical board games. Let's do it for reals this time. Let me talk about, let me start by defining what I mean. So I'm going to use a few quotes that I find particularly useful. Post-colonialism is all the culture affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day. Post-colonization is a process in which colonized societies participate over a long period through different phases and modes of engagement with the colonizing power during and after the period of direct colonial rule. The forms of colonialism included in this focus pertain to both settler colonialism, that is those with a focus on assimilation and uniformity, and exploitation colonies, that is those with a focus on association and diversity. Settler colonialism is sometimes referred to as a Greek model, and exploitation colonialism is sometimes referred to as a Roman model. Included in this notion is this idea that post-colonial critique incorporates the legacy of the syncretic traditions of Marxism that developed outside the West in the course of anti-colonial struggles, and subsequently in the development of the further forms of emancipation, gender, ethnicity, and class necessary for liberation from bourgeois nationalism. The extension of the meaning of postcoloniality into notions of class emancipation away from nationalism is highly significant in expanding our sense of where games, war games, approach post-colonial perspectives. With that in mind, we have an increasingly large number of board war games that I consider to be post-colonial in at least some respect from the early 2010s onwards. There are games like Khyber Rifles, kind of in Afghanistan, subheader, A Distant Plain, Navajo Wars, Pax Pamir, 2 editions, Comacheria, Colonial Twilights, The White Tribe, Gandhi, The Red Burnous, and recently just released is the British Way. These games have strategic level agency for non-colonialist actors, and some of them also depict political complexity with multifactional modeling and asymmetric modeling. If you've played or seen any of the coin games, Coin for counterinsurgency, you'll have an appreciation of how there are different factions with different victory conditions. So there are different motivations with different resources and different abilities. You might also note how many games here are related to that coin system, which began with the 2012 release of Andean Abyss, published by GMT and designed by my friend and living legend, Volko Ronke, who has also been a guest here and spoken twice, I believe, and spoken eloquently, as is wont, on coin games and card games. Pax Pamir, which I just mentioned, is a game about what is often referred to as the Great Game, British and Russian imperial rivalry in Asia, with a focus on Afghanistan. And of course, we could take a colonial point of view on that, and that has certainly been done in the past, and we could, I suppose, also just keep on doing that. But Pax Pamir is a reminder that there are other ways to conceive of this and other perspectives. This is a game where players control Afghan tribal leaders, and they must navigate a way through the competing agendas of British and Russian imperial projects and Afghan nationalists. This is not only a post-colonial framing through non-imperial agency, it also presents this agency as more than a replication of colonialist motivations. There is more here than just expansion in the context of depleting resources. This is not a game about out-colonizing colonizers. So this is a game with a political modeling with a deeper appreciation of strategic complexities, deeper than a colonialist confrontation. Here, asymmetries are depicted and explored within the game system. Now, as I say, this is not a rare exception. There are, as per the previous slide, numerous examples of games exhibiting these post-colonial elements. In fact, let's bring it back and make the point that the second edition of Pax Pamir, 2019, raised over $400,000 on Kickstarter. And I think this gives some sense that the needle is perhaps shifting, the marketplace is adapting to new audience interests. We might also add that there are more games coming, there are more in development, bearing post-colonial perspectives that engage in various ways with the notions of post-colonialism I've been discussing. There are, I suspect, many more now brewing. This is a shameless plug to my co-design, this Rebellion Britannia. All of which means I'm suggesting that we may be at a critical mass threshold of what we could call a post-colonial turn in relation to commercial historical board war games. And to be clear, I'm using this term and not suggesting that we have had colonial games in the past and now we don't, that we're now sort of at this magical point that we only have post-colonial games. That's completely not what I'm trying to communicate to you. Rather, I'm suggesting that we have colonial games and these are likely to keep existing. And as I previously said, in the context of games that are really considering history seriously, we would want these to continue if we're trying to model that kind of history. But I think now we also, this is my suggestion to you, I think we also have post-colonial games in addition to those colonial games. there's more complexity here too, because these didn't just pop out of nowhere. They didn't suddenly appear in 2012. So maybe that's a good moment to pause and see if I haven't seen if there are any questions, because I've not been looking and my eyesight's quite bad. So I didn't see if there were any questions, but I happily will take some if there are any now. Otherwise, I'll just keep moving the rest of the talk.
If you have any questions for our speaker, you can just pop them in the chat. We'll just pause here for a moment. So we have a question from Patrick Rail, who asks, how does this reflect the changing historiography of military history, what you've been talking about?
Hi, Patrick. Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, I suppose it depends who you ask. If you're asking me, which it seems like you are, I feel like it's indicative of. I talked a little bit about it earlier, and in fact, I'm about to say a bit more about it now. But the way in which this connects back to the talk that Jason Matthews gave last year with this. He described it as being in this golden era of pole mill simulation games, where we are starting to think more broadly about how we model war, and we're incorporating politics in a way in which has infrequently been done in the past. So I think it's not a coincidence. I don't think I think they're entirely connected, right? So I think that we have this ability now, this interest in war that's going beyond the sort of more narrow mindset. I know that you've spoken about this, Patrick, in an interview you gave with Jason Perez on Shelf Stories, which I'm very much of the same mind, that there's been a degree of, if you like, fetishization about military history. It's almost as if the origins of the hobby lie with people who are working with the DoD, and they're saying, here's my sort of thought experiment is, what if I could conduct a war in such a way that all of that pesky politics that interferes with the way in which war could be conducted is sidelined. So that's what we saw originally, where again, Jason spoke about this, where we see some very simplistic modeling of politics, or no modeling of it at all. This is sort of troubling. It should be troubling if you're in a democracy that has a sense that the military people are just going to take over. This is also terrible history, of course, because it's terrible storytelling, because it implies that we have these very neat beginnings and endings to wars. That if I can only take Berlin in time in a World War II game, then everything, all the other problems go away. This is why games like Mark Herman's Churchill came out a few years ago is super interesting, because it's breaking down some of those barriers. It's more unsettling in terms of the easy narratives that we're able to kind of utilize. It's a 3-player co-opetition game where you work as, for the benefit of those of you who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, there are three players all playing the parts of the 3 large allies, playing jointly against the Axis powers, but really sort of tussling for a post-war world. To me, that's much more interesting and much better history. So yes, I think those things are all connected, and perhaps in some ways the biggest mystery is, why has it taken us so long to get to this stage where we're comfortable and more interested in broadening out the ways in which we model history, and we integrate the politics in a more developed way that's not just focusing on this sort of rather bizarre, sort of abstract ways of thinking about how wars end. If you think about it, a classic game like Third Reich, perhaps Hitler's War is a slightly easier example to give, where you have a victory condition for the Axis powers to hold on to Berlin by the end of the war. Obviously this is sort of nonsense, really. You can't imagine a OKW conference in 1939 saying, if only we can have one unit in supply in Berlin in 1945, we'll have won. So I think that's a fascinating challenge for designers working in this space, figuring out, well, how can we do a better job of thinking more broadly about political ends, ways, and means, the objectives there that integrate political dynamics far more broadly and deeply. I don't know if I really answered that question there.
We have another question here from Christopher Daly, who notes that one of the struggles with capturing history in a game that's supposed to be fun, it often happens that fairness and balance is at odds with the historical context. Some games allow for this by defining victory in a way that's appropriate for the context, but how does that align with the idea of agency of a colonized population?
Well, I mean, I think in some ways coin is critical to our way of thinking about that, in terms of, I'm not suggesting it's the only approach you can take, and I'm about to say some more about why that isn't the only approach you could take. But I think it's demonstrated that there are ways of representing asymmetries within the design that can align that design with history that feels recognizable, it feels sort of serious, at the same time as that can be made to be entertaining and enjoyable to play, and can be balanced. So, balance does not mean symmetry. Balance really is to do with feeling like everyone has a roughly equal way of attaining victory, if perhaps depending on your game, but perhaps depending on your levels of skill that are involved. So I'm not pretending that it's not an issue, but I do think there are some approaches that we can take that can keep us locked into thinking about things that approach things without having to necessarily devolve into, can I out-colonize this other? Can I out-colonize the colonizer if you're in an anti-colonial actor, right? I think that we're still just scratching the surface of the kinds of things that we can do here. And it's the game I just briefly mentioned earlier, that Rebellion Britannia game, one of my own designs, is concerned with not making it seem as if the indigenous British tribes, if they could just meet the Romans in a pitched battle and I don't know, they rolled the right dice. There aren't dice in the game, but the point is, if they could just be lucky enough, they'd win a pitched battle and everything would be fine. It's a relatively simple card-driven game, but even there are ways of not falling into that trap of representing, of trying to sort of distorting a history by having those indigenous tribes be cast essentially as just colonizers or poor colonizers who aren't as good as the other colonizers at colonizing. You see what I mean? You can find other ways of giving them things to do that make them difficult or problematic, and in fact that it does incorporate some political modeling. I don't want to kind of sort of tangent into that too much, but it involves thinking about ways in which the British tribes are a problem when they're war bands, but in fact in some ways they're more of a problem when they're a political entity, when they're political tension, because the Roman legions can't solve that problem. They can't march into a region and dominate that political tension. In fact, it will exacerbate it. It will make it worse. So this is an interesting space that we can play with, and I think that Coin has done a tremendous job in opening some of the doors to how we can think about that.
We have one last question, and I think we can turn it back over to you to continue your presentation. We have Tamara O'Callaghan, who asks, who is the audience for these games? She notes that she is interested not only in the game designer's intended audience, but also the actual audience, those who are drawn to those sorts of games. In other words, can post-colonial games teach post-colonial theoretical approaches, or do they reinforce colonial values in some of the game audience?
Yeah, well, good question. I suppose, again, it might depend who you ask. I think that not so much the games that I've been talking about, but there are other games that sit not really in this kind of, for better or worse than it. I'm not sure it's that helpful really, but we think of it as this sort of war games space. Might be better to think about it as a history games or historical games space. There are some games outside of that sit more within the mainstream. I'm thinking about games like Colonialism that actually, that's a game that is really attempting to critique colonialism, and it's trying to not shy away from slavery. It's a game with a chain and a ball and a cuff on the front cover, and slaves are involved in the game, and they've made some attempt in that game to not glorify slavery and the whole institution. I think it feels clear to me that the designer is attempting to critique it and to say something about how abysmal it is. Now, of course, whether people interpret it that way is harder to know. But I think I just heard something. Oh, I think recording dropped out. So I'm not sure if you missed any of that, but I was saying in some ways that game runs counter to what I've been talking about here with these games that sit more within this space where people are interested in history. That seems to be the draw that brings people to it. I think that people want to be entertained and enjoy the games, but I think that part of that enjoyment is there's a wider circle than just the game itself, right? There's also, I think for a lot of those types of players, they enjoy reading around the subject and reading and playing the games that sort of entwined in their learning experience. Is it true that they are perceiving post-colonial perspectives through those games? I don't know for sure, but I would say that if you say the mechanics is the message is in the mechanics, then I would say that a number of these games actually do align accordingly, that they're not putting you in a position where you think, well, hey, if only my indigenous forces could create a large enough army, or they could get enough swords together, or they could dominate militarily, then I think that they ought to be doing that job of making us think differently. And I don't know, hard to know, but my feeling is that that audience is taking it on board, and I think that my reason for thinking that is not just, I think, faith. It's the fact that there's a trajectory. This has been changing. There's not been 2 or 3 games, and I think they're interesting to talk about. Since 2010, there's been a growth of these kinds of games. And like I said, in the case of Pax Pamir, that kind of $400,000 figure makes me feel as if publishers are getting interested in this. Other designers are getting interested in this, and an audience is starting to coalesce around it, which makes me think that something is happening. Now, I don't know for sure whether they're interpreting it in the way in which those designers or publishers might wish, but like I said, I think the mechanics probably bear out the fact that some of that message is getting home. All right.
I think you can go on ahead with your presentation. I fell with all the questions in the chat for the moment.
Great, thanks, Nicholas. I shall do so. Okay, so this is a very brief history of post-colonialism in board war games. I'm going to go back beyond this 2012 and try and explore some of how we got here. I'm going to do this quite quickly, though. So we talked a bit about Andean Abyss 2012. This coin series, I think I already touched on this too, this focuses on multifactional irregular warfare, including political as well as military asymmetric modeling, including asymmetric dispositions, resources, capabilities, and objectives. As I said earlier, first designed by Volko Ronke, ex-CIA analyst. Many other designers have collaborated with him or have collaborated with him in the past or are working with this system on their own. And I think this is a good place to look. Yeah, counterinsurgency games. There are a couple of other games coming out around the same sort of time, though, that have strategic level agency for colonialist opponents. So I don't think coin isn't the full picture. So I want to go back a little bit before coin. Before coin, we have Labyrinth, War on Terror. So this has some coin-like elements, strategic level agency, asymmetric ends, ways, and means, and also is designed by Volko. We also have Black Eagles, came out 2010, with a focus on, it focuses on a defining moment in colonial history, a moment that demonstrates the agency and abilities of indigenous peoples to resist. The Haitian Revolution was the first and only slave uprising that led to the establishment of a free state without slavery and ruled by non-whites and former slaves. We also have this, not published till 2016, but it was designed around 2010. It's Aoka, about the Greek Cypriot War of Independence, which combines military with political modeling to not only give anti-colonialist actors agency, but it also demonstrates some of the political complexity of the history involved. What is of real significance here is the designer. So Brian Train, I think he's actually here. I think I saw his name pop up, but someone I'm delighted to also think of as a friend he's a highly prolific designer, 64 titles on Board Game Geek, but I only checked that on Saturday, so it might have changed again. There's a number of games I want to talk about briefly. Andates, about the Greek Civil War, 1947 to 49. It's a two-player strategic level game about the conflict between communist-inspired guerrillas and the Greek state. Kandahar, a two-player strategic level game about conflict between the Taliban and the Afghan National Security Forces in southern Afghanistan. Algeria, the War of Independence, 54 to 62, is a two-player strategic level game about the conflict between the FLN, nationalist guerrillas, and the French government. Shining Path, the struggle for Peru, is a two-player strategic level game about the conflict between the Shining Path Maoist guerrillas and the Peruvian state, 1980 to ongoing. Tupamaro is a two-player strategic level game about the conflict between the Tupamaro guerrillas and the Uruguayan state, 68 to 72. Now, all are concerned with modeling civic unrest or insurgency, leaning hard into the topics of asymmetric factions and political dimensions, and with narratives frequently ignored by other designers. Algeria is perhaps a particular note, not only because it foreshadows Brian's colonial twilight on the same topic, but also because Volko has cited it as a direct inspiration for his card-driven Labyrinth, which followed 10 years later. The player actions in Algeria turn missions, and they help us trace the lineage of the inspiration that led to Labyrinth, and from there into the Coin series with its different missions. Its different sort of operations and strategic special operations and so on. Though they're given different names in some of the other Coin games. We should also perhaps note that Volko has cited the importance of Twilight Struggle, Jason Matthews and Ananda Gupta's game, in its card-driven system, also contributing to Volko's Labyrinth. In these games, we see abstract concepts brought front and center to designs to represent non-kinetic values that help define a faction's capacity and or its resources to act, as well as a measure of a faction's capacity to achieve its objectives. From Tupamaro onwards, we see the concept of political will as a measure of quantifiable progress towards victory, or at least defeat, avoiding defeat, with 0 representing catastrophic collapse and the ability to maintain struggle. This kind of global game loss index has a long lineage in board games, so board war games, or at least goes back as far as 1965 with Vietnam, even if it wasn't utilized that much through the 60s and 70s, 80s and 90s, like I was just talking about earlier, in fact. But there is a lineage that takes us back to this concept of war doesn't end when a faction runs out of units. That would be kind of insane, but and not really representing much history that I can immediately think of. Political will is really the fuel that drives a state's capacity to fight or resist. Prior to Brian's seismic contributions, there are only a handful of games in this space, most of which he was certainly aware of in formative years. I believe he was well aware of Vietnam, just spoke about then. Nicaragua is a 2-player strategic level game about the guerrilla wars. This is about in the Nicaragua of 1961 to 1988. That was published in Strategy and Tactics, number 120. The modeling of the political dimension with intelligence operations and propaganda is suggestive of some of Brian's designs in this space. Brian has openly cited his influence, I think, in a Beyond Solitaire podcast with Liz Davidson. He cited his influence that came from the video game Hidden Agenda. This is a game that systematizes political complexities. This is actually a screenshot from Hidden Agenda on the screen here. It systematizes political complexities to represent how decisions made in the formulation of power dynamics restrict future latitude to make broader choices. In essence, an over-reliance on a single faction can hem in the player and constrain the breadth of future choices. This appreciation of the continuity between the acquisition and the maintenance of political power speaks to an appreciation of the continuity and deep integration between political and military dynamics. Again, I refer you back to Jason Matthews' talk of last year. The broad philosophy of Hidden Agenda appears evident in Brian's work. There are a few others to explore. I'm not going to say too much about them. I'm probably taking up too much time. But South Africa, The Death of Colonialism, sort of interesting because it's a game that the victory conditions are such that in the full campaign version, the US player is able to win only by not losing for the 40 turns of the game. The NLF player wins by capturing. I'm talking about Saigon. Excuse me. I'm going to talk about the Death of Colonialism, which is interesting because in that standard version of the game, it's not possible for the RSA, the government faction, to win. It's only a matter of seeing how long they may hold out for. It's only in an optional variant that there's some possibility of a victory through the advent of the Third World War. So the game South Africa, The Death of Colonialism, is overtly postulating the inevitability of apartheid's demise 13 years before it happened. And the game also features police and guerrilla units in addition to conventional forces, which have contact and evasion capabilities too. A couple of others I'm going to briefly mention: Fortress Rhodesia and First Indochina War. In fact, two more: Dien Bien Phu and Rebellion Guerrilla Warfare on the planet Somber, which is a sci-fi setting, but really it's about Vietnam and was originally designed to be about Vietnam, but then the designers or the publishers reframed it so it wasn't overtly about Vietnam. All right, let me just very briefly touch on this then, because I said I would when in the introduction to the talk. Is this approach here to stay, or might there be a post-colonial counter-term? This perhaps addresses the question I think Karen asked earlier. Well, Douglas Copeland's the I think, wonderful Canadian novelist said, nothing very, very good or very, very bad lasts for very, very long. So who knows? But I do think that there's sufficient momentum in this advent of post-colonialism and related pole mill games that it certainly, there's no indication that it's imminently about to dry up. And my feeling, like I said before, is that the market is moving in such a way, and that there are perhaps people like me who are coming at it from a scholarly perspective, who are also starting to talk about this and attach this to some of the other thinking that's happening in post-colonialism. And it feels as if it's unlikely to just unravel. In addition to which, there's just so much unexplored and underexplored history here that it's a treasure trove of riches. There are all these stories to be told, all these perspectives to explore that we have largely not. So in conclusion, post-colonialism, despite what I said right at the beginning of the talk, does, or at least I think it very much can, exist. Its salient features are strategic level agency for anti-colonialist actors, making them actors. If you're a player and you get to play a non-colonialist entity, a faction, a state polity, you're having agency. And if that's in a strategic forum, in the context of strategy, grand strategy, or perhaps even operational level, then that could be meaningful agency. It could be agency that you could do something with to cast another contrasting narrative. Another key feature is multifactionalism. There are many more than just two agents involved. I'm just thinking a little bit now of the Alex Knight's Land and Freedom, a game about the Spanish Civil War. That it's a up to 3-player game, and each of those players takes on the Republican faction in a co-opetition game, fighting against the fascists. And there's a complexity here. Obviously, Alex has controlled that for design reasons, but there's an appreciation of the complexity involved in that situation, hence that co-opetition. And connected to that is this political complexity, which also opens the door to us thinking about things in the post-colonial framework. So I'm going to suggest that I think that it's now sufficiently part of our landscape that I think we might be, at least in terms of historical board war games, at something that we might call post-colonial turn, bearing in mind, I'm not suggesting that this is an irrevocable turn or even that colonial games stop. I think the roots of this lie in coin games, and earlier in the work of Brian Train in particular. And of course, Brian Train's also made coin games with Volko, and he has his own one coming out on China. And Colonial Twilight was really just him as well. And there are also some other elements we see in a few precursors, but they're generally few and far between next to the weight of other war games we have that really ignore these perspectives. And I think it probably is here to stay. I'll refer you to the Zenobia Award, which is a organization, perhaps not coincidentally, Volko was also a key instigator in that helps to, it seeks to help underrepresented designers from underrepresented communities to get their work out into a commercial space. And a number of those designs that were in that competition in 2021 have been picked up by publishers, at least 3. I think there might be more that are about to come out, or in various, actually, yes, probably 4 games that are well in the development stages, and we might see some release from them soon. And this is an award that wasn't just a one-off. The intention is to grow it, and I believe that there are some more developments afoot, perhaps for later this year or next year. So again, maybe another indicator that there's some traction here and that things are moving. I put a select bibliography here for people who are probably maybe at the computer, I want to do a screenshot of that or want to check it out later, I won't pause for very long on that. But so that is the end. There are some contact details there if you want to get hold of me, probably email or Twitter are the two best ways to do that. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maurice. Sorry if anybody hears the announcements going on in the background, but we got a few questions here in the chat for you before you head on. So we have Richard S. here who asks, he thanks you for the chat or for the discussion, and he's asking if you could maybe talk some about like video games, particularly games like Victoria 3 from Paradox Interactive, which is like squarely about 19th century colonialism. How do you view the struggle to provide realistic game elements representing 19th century policies, strategies, tactics that are today widely viewed as morally odious, but were the norms at the time? And is there a broader concern that developers should have that at their games may be used by some elements of society to justify those concepts? What can designers do to avoid this?
So I haven't played that game, so I'm going to tread lightly there. But one thing I will say is that you can always look closer and look deeper, and then probably you'll find something more interesting going on. Pax Britannica, a board game I spoke about earlier, puts people in this position of players take on a role of a major world power in the late 19th century. And they have the capacity to move units and build units, take over places, as you might expect. But there's almost no real, it's a very, very light political modeling. There's not much that represents the way in which continuity of governments, for example, is a problem. So again, it's sort of a demonstration of a sort of peculiar militaristic viewpoint, really, that says, hey, what if the civil servants and the military can essentially run everything, and they ignore, for the most part, apart from a random die roll that might mean that a government gets in that gives you some minor advantage or disadvantage, that is not derailed by the politics of what's happening. And I think that this is disturbing if you're living in a democracy or you want to try and represent how democracies work. But I also think it's just not very interesting. I think that when we think about governments as monoliths, we lose a lot of humanity about really what's happening, what happens when you get people in trying to figure out things together. You know, we'll often have games about, for example, the Boer War, right? And to me, what's really interesting about that is the liberal opposition to that war inside Britain. It's kind of, well, what's Gladstone got to say about it? How does the government maintain its will to fight, if you like, to kind of, how does it persuade the populace that this war is worth conducting? And it's not just a question of, hey, can I take these key cities before the game clock runs out? And so what I'm saying is that if you just peel away the layers and you look a bit deeper and you just don't get lazy about the way in which we're going to set this game system up, you can find all sorts of interesting things that ask questions about the way in which these wars are conducted. And you find these other perspectives, these kind of anti-war perspectives, for example, or anti-colonialist perspectives inside colonialist states, inside imperial states, that mean that we're not locked into just, hey, let's expand and dominate. Obviously, there's a connection between, there's an easy connection between those kinds of mechanics that lock us, that have kind of locked us into those sorts of narratives. But I think if you are prepared to look and find and explore, you will find other ways of approaching it. It kind of comes back to the question that was asked earlier, like, well, how do you stop people misinterpreting that or coming at it from a different way and thinking, yeah, but that's contrary to kind of what your design intentions are. And the short answer is, I'm not sure that you entirely can stop them. People will interpret as they wish, but you just have to keep pushing and trying and hoping that your mechanics align in such a way that it gives you some decent shot at conveying what it is you're trying to convey.
Thank you for the great answer. We've got also Chris Daly here who notes that whenever he introduces DC policy nerds to Labyrinth, which you mentioned in your presentation, no matter their politics, everybody eagerly engages in extraordinary renditions and torture tactics. Can a designer relatively expect players to engage in good faith kind of morality when they're playing these types of games?
I don't know that a designer can expect that. I mean, you can try and set things up in such a way that the incentives kind of align with what you're planning. But I mean, if you have a game incentive to do something, players will explore and potentially exploit that. So the question is, well, the question is related to your modeling of that. Are you going to, is there any downside to that action that you are going to model? And if so, how are you going to do that? But again, yeah, I think it comes down to sort of exploring and looking for uneasy answers. You're going to still be sitting within a framework of, well, I've got a game that I want a certain kind of experience, and it's a certain play length and certain components, certain complexity, which will sort of bind your areas of maneuver. And ultimately, you've got to make some sort of decision as to what your area of focus is. You can't do everything. You're going to have to try and clarify this one key perspective you're going to try and explore. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I think that you can try and set up incentives that make sense within the game system and see if you have counter incentives that deter players. But I mean, players generally exploit systems.
Thank you for the great answer, Maurice. I think I'm losing a little bit of connection here, so I'm going to have to probably end the recording here. But thank you so much for the talk, and you guys can stay on the line and answer any questions that come up. But this will be available on our YouTube channel